I ruined a whole day of good work because I trusted a little arrow on a screen. I was setting out the frame for a garden bench, and I wanted the seat to face true north so the low morning light would fall across it just right. So I did the modern thing. I pulled the phone out of my apron, opened the compass on it, laid it flat on the bench, and marked my line off that. Cut all my rails to that line, chopped my mortises to it. And when I walked out the next morning with my coffee, the whole thing sat skewed to the sun by a good hand's width. My phone had been lying to me the entire time, tugged sideways by the cast iron bed of my table saw and an old coffee can full of steel screws sitting a foot away. Iron pulls on a compass. It always has, and it always will. That was a Tuesday in a heated shop with a computer in my pocket. Now here is the part that still takes the wind out of me. Around 1,000 years ago, men shoved open wooden boats past the last low smudge of land and crossed the entire North Atlantic with no compass, no charts, and not a single screen in anyone's apron. And they did it a full 5 centuries before Columbus ever thought to raise a sail. This story does not begin out on the gray water. It begins with the sun and with a piece of wood no bigger than the palm of my hand, because the Norse did not beat that ocean with cold nerve alone. They read the sky and the sea the way you and I read the grain of a board, and they carried the whole map in their heads and in a handful of small tools shaped from oak and pine. By the year 1000, they had already stepped from Norway out to the Shetlands, to the Faroes, onto Iceland, then across to Greenland, and at last to a shore they named Vinland. We know that final leg was real and not just a fireside saga, because up in Newfoundland there is a low, windswept place called Lance aux Meadows, and the turf houses and the iron boat rivets and the little curls of worked wood pressed into that ground are unmistakably Norse. They stood on the soil of North America, while most of Europe still believed the world ran out of edge somewhere west of Ireland. So how did they hold a line across open water with nothing on deck that you or I would call an instrument? Let me walk you through it, one method at a time, the same slow way an old shipwright named Halvard once walked me through a scarf joint at a heritage yard out in Essex. But before we talk about finding the way, you have to understand the boat, because I am a shipwright before I am anything else, and the boat is half the answer. The deep water ship they used for these crossings was called a knurr, which was a broad, deep-bellied cargo vessel, cousin to the sleek longship, but built to carry cattle and timber and families across open sea rather than to raid a coastline. And the way she was built is the thing that saved them. Her hull was laid up clinker fashion, which means the planks overlap each other along their edges like the clapboards on an old barn, each plank riveted to the one below, and the whole skin left springy on purpose. A rigid box would have been hammered to splinters out there. A clinker hull flexes. She works and gives and twists with every swell, like a living ribcage breathing under you, and she sheds the blow instead of fighting it. I have laid my hand flat on a reconstruction of one of these hulls and felt the whole side of the boat move like something alive. That is the vessel these men trusted their wives and children to. Now, with the right boat under you, you still have to point her somewhere and keep her pointed. So, here is the first real trick. Everything hangs on a habit that sailors much later gave a name to, latitude sailing. That simply means holding your east and west line by keeping the sun and the stars at the very same height in the sky, day after day, night after night. Let me make it plain. If you already know that your home fjord and the southern tip of Greenland sit at the same level on the earth, the same distance up from the middle of the world, then you do not need to know your longitude at all, which was a thing no soul on that deck could have measured anyway. You only have to keep the noon sun climbing to the same height above the horizon each day and keep the North Star riding at the same fist off the water each night. Sail west while you hold that height dead steady, and the curve of the earth itself walks you straight to the latitude you were aiming for. So a Norse skipper would run up his own home coast first, north or south, until the midday sun sat at exactly the right height and the pole star stood at the correct fist off his bow. Only then, with his line found, would he swing the boat and point her out into the empty west. He was not steering toward a place on a map. He was steering along an invisible ring drawn around the whole planet, and he held to that ring by height alone. Hold your height, and you hold your line. That is the entire spine of the thing, and everything else these people did was simply in service of keeping that one measurement honest. If you feel that old pull toward things built to outlast you, let me point you to my book, Secrets of the Shipyard. It is that same craft, set down across 16 chapters, from wooden tree nails that grip tighter with every passing year to watertight fang that keeps the sea out with no glue and no screws. If that stirs something in you, scan the code up on your screen. Now step back and really sit with what that habit asked of a person, because holding a line by the height of the sun is a beautiful idea that leans on one thing the North Atlantic almost never hands you, and that is how they turned the idea into a tool. To keep that height honest, they did not squint and guess. They built an instrument for it out of wood, and they built it so well that we are still arguing over the pieces we dig up. As best we can reconstruct it, the tool was a flat wooden board they used like a floating sundial, a thing some now call a sun shadow board. Picture a smooth disc of pine with a short peg standing straight up out of its center. That little upright has a name worth carrying home. It is a gnomon, the old word for the pin on any sundial that throws the shadow. You float that disc in a bowl of water so it settles dead level no matter how the boat rolls beneath you. And at midday, you watch where the tip of the gnomon's shadow lands. Carve a ring into the board at the right spot for your home latitude, and now you own a target. If the noon shadow reaches exactly to your ring, you are true on your line. If it falls short of the ring, you have slipped south, so you steer up. If it overshoots, you have run too far north, so you ease her down. No numbers, no reading, no fretting over a needle, just a shadow touching a groove you cut with your own knife. And out in Greenland, the diggers turned up a broken wooden disc with careful notches scored around its rim, and a great many people who have given their lives to this work believe it is a fragment of exactly this kind of instrument. Sit with the craft in that for a moment. A man carved his safe passage home into a plank of wood and trusted his family's lives to a line of shadow crossing wet oak. I have made replicas of that little board on my own bench, floated one in a bucket, and watched the shadow creep to the ring. And I will tell you, it feels less like using a tool and more like asking the sky an honest question. There was another object they may have carried too, stranger than any of this, and I gave you my word I would come back to it, because it is the one that still splits the room in two. For a while, holding a line by the sun works so well it feels like cheating, and then the weather remembers you are only human, because the sun trick leans on one condition the North Atlantic rarely grants: clear sky. Up in those latitudes, the cloud rolls in and sits for days. The fog lies down on the water like sodden wool, and the sun becomes a rumor behind gray. A shadowboard is a fine servant, right up until there is no shadow left to read. So the puzzle that has nagged sailors and scholars alike for a long time is a simple one. What on earth did they do when they could not find the sun at all? And this is where we come to the stone I promised you. And I have to be straight with you about it, because the honest telling is the better story anyway. The leading idea, and I want to be plain that this is a theory and not a settled fact, is that they carried what the old tales call a sunstone. Not some magic jewel out of a saga, but a very real, very ordinary crystal that Iceland happens to be riddled with. A clear calcite the old quarrymen there knew as Iceland spar. This crystal does something quietly astonishing. The light coming down from the sky, even a sky choked solid with cloud, is polarized into faint rings around the hidden sun, and a clear calcite splits and brightens that light differently depending on how you turn it against the murk. So the theory runs that a navigator held the crystal up to the dull gray, turned it slowly, and watched for the point where the light passing through it evened out or suddenly flared, and that told him roughly where the true sun was sitting behind all that cloud. Once he knew where the sun hid, he could go back to his shadowboard and back to his line. Now I will not sell you a certainty I do not own. Nobody has pulled a labeled sunstone out of a Viking navigator's sea chest. But sailors have tested the trick with real calcite under real overcast and found it works well enough to locate a hidden sun. There is a mention of a sunstone in the old writings, and a crystal was even found aboard a much later shipwreck lying right beside its navigation gear. So it stands today as the best answer we have for how they saw a sun no eye could see. Trust the wood and stay humble about the stone. But here is the part I love most, as a man who spent 30 years learning to read a material instead of measuring it. The greatest instrument on that whole boat was never carved at all. It was the ocean itself and the sky over it, and a lifetime of learning to read them both like a page. These men knew that a long, deep swell rolling in from a steady quarter was as good as a paved road, because the great Atlantic swells hold their heading for hundreds of miles, and a helmsman could feel that rhythm come up through the hull in the pitch black and steer by the very lift and drop of his own boat. They watched the color of the water change from the deep, clean blue of the open sea to the greener, cloudier tone that whispers of a coast and a shallowing bottom somewhere ahead. They marked the drifting mats of weed and the odd bit of landwood floating far out where no land showed itself. And they read the seabirds like a signpost nailed to the sky, because a puffin or a guillemot beating along at dusk is not wandering, it is going home, and if you follow the evening flight of a bird with a full beak, you will very often raise the rock it is feeding its young on. They knew which whales fed over which banks, and a pod of them blowing in a certain place meant a certain shoal was near. They even read the driftwood itself the way I read a board today, because a length of spruce or larch riding the current out past Iceland had drifted the whole way from Siberia on a known river of sea, and its arrival told a careful eye which way the great water was truly moving under the boat. They knew that a certain cloud will pile up and hang dead still over an island you cannot yet see, snagged there like a scrap of wool on a nail, while every other cloud in the sky slides on past it. The sea was a living book to these people, and they had learned to read every single page of it. And all of that reading, every swell and bird and shift of color, was bound together by the one tool we always forget to count: memory. There was no chart to unroll across that deck, so the route itself lived inside the mind, handed down out loud from a father to a son, and from an old steersman to a young one, season upon season, until a boy knew a passage he had never once sailed, the way you know the walk to your own back door in the dark. Leave this headland with the pole star at this height. Hold it for 7 days. When you smell the ice on the wind and see the fulmars wheel and turn, you are near the Greenland coast, so bear south along it until you raise the green home fields of the settlement. Whole ocean crossings were carried this way, in verse and in habit, and in the exact keeping of an oral tradition, which is simply hard knowledge, kept alive by being spoken aloud rather than written down. It is the very same way old Halvard carried every joint in that Essex yard inside his hands, never once cracking open a book to find it. And the stakes of that were as high as stakes come, because a verse remembered wrong, a height held a touch too long, a coast raised 100 miles off the mark could put a whole family onto the wrong shore or onto no shore at all. The map was not on the deck. The map was in the man. Lose the man, and you have very nearly lost the map. So put the whole thing together and stand back and look hard at what these people actually pulled off. With a shadow crossing a wooden disc, a crystal held up to a hopeless sky, an ear tuned to the swell, an eye kept on the birds, and a rote carried down in spoken verse, they crossed the widest, coldest, meanest ocean on this earth and found their way home again, over and over, a full 500 years before the ships we all learned about in school. And there I stood, in a warm, dry shop with a computer in my apron, cutting a garden bench crooked to the sun, because I trusted an arrow over the honest sky above my own roof. The sun never lied to those men. It never does. It was only ever the little needle dragged sideways by all our iron that could not be trusted, and they understood that 1,000 years ago. I had to relearn it the hard way, one crooked bench at a time. If any part of this stirred something, the same old-world thinking runs through every chapter of Secrets of the Shipyard, from the centuries-old ways of keeping wood alive against salt and weather, the pitch and the tar and the linseed oil, to 3 full-build projects for your own 2 hands. You will find the link waiting down in the description. And if you want more of this ocean-tested, centuries-lasting way of building, subscribe to the Master Shipwright, and let us keep saving these old crafts together.